Okay, so we're going to start the endocrine system today. We're not going to get very far through the endocrine system. Unfortunately, deadlines have been moved and we're on a bit of a time crunch to finish up with our course. So I gave you a crash course video. That is literally the most important things we would be looking at with the endocrine system. So we're just going to get through a couple of those. But he does an excellent job at getting all the major components of what we were supposed to be looking at in this unit. So you're going to need a title. The endocrine system. And then we're just going to move on. So again, I do a whole thing with this system. Fun, but we can't really do any of it. So we're just going to do the very basics. So your endocrine system, as far as your definition goes, is a series of glands. Glands are ductless. That means they do not have ducts. Unlike we have different types of glands. Your sweat glands have ducts. But the endocrine system glands are ductless, and they secrete chemicals, and these chemicals we call hormones, by direct diffusion into the bloodstream. So your endocrine system, as you probably learned from the video, works with your nervous system. The two work together. The endocrine system is usually triggered by the nervous system in many, many cases. And then these chemical messengers get into the bloodstream and they might cause more hormones to be released, or they have certain effects on cells. So your definition of hormones: chemical messengers sent to many parts of the body to produce a specific effect on a target cell or organ. And the endocrine system works in parallel with the nervous system and is linked via the hypothalamus. So we didn't have time to do the brain. So we usually spend a day or two in the brain, and we actually label a sheep's brain, a real one, and we just don't have time to do that. But the pituitary gland, if you notice here, is located, just hangs off the sort of the bottom of the brain. And the hypothalamus is found directly above that. So those are two important things. We'll be looking at the pituitary gland tomorrow. So the hypothalamus is the part of the brain that links the pituitary with the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland is part of the endocrine system, and actually releases a lot of hormones that you will not need to memorize this year, but normally you would need to and may need to in university. So these chemical receptors work by accessing target cells. So that your hormones do not affect every cell in your body. They have specific cells that they target. So the target cells will contain these things called receptor proteins. So the circulating hormones bind to their specific receptor proteins, which triggers other reactions in target cells, like a key fits into a lock. So you find this note is relaying a lot of what we just heard in that video. There's two types of hormones: steroid hormones. And again, as was said, these are lipid-based. If you remember back to your macromolecules unit, that steroids are under the macromolecule lipids. And so steroid hormones, they bind to receptor proteins inside the nucleus. So these ones can get right into the cell, as this diagram shows. Right? They can get right into the cell where they bind inside the cell, and then can actually get inside the nucleus and cause transcription and translation right at the genetic level with the DNA. So examples of this hormone are testosterone, estrogen, and cortisol. You're probably familiar with the cortisol from the last video, and testosterone and estrogen. And again, we won't be getting to the reproductive system. And then there's also water-soluble hormones, and if you remember, these do not make it through the phospholipid bilayer of cells, so their receptor proteins are on the surface of the target cells only. So if that's not their target cell, they're not going to bind to the receptors. And then we have tropic hormones, and these are hormones that target endocrine glands and stimulate them to release other hormones. So the hypothalamus is actually an endocrine gland as well as part of the nervous system. So it actually functions as both. It's an endocrine gland because it secretes hormones which travel to the pituitary gland, and it also conducts electricity to other glands. So it's part of the nervous and endocrine system. So the nervous and endocrine system work together, and several chemicals function both as neurotransmitters. Hopefully you remember what the neurotransmitters are in the nervous system. And they also function as hormones. So an example of this is epinephrine. The endocrine and nervous system are regulated by feedback loops. So remember we talked about feedback loops, positive being quite rare and the negative feedback loops being very common. And these two systems often work together. So this is a great example of how the two systems work together. So in breastfeeding, the baby suckling initiates a sensory, which means an electrical message in the mother's neurons that travel to the hypothalamus, that part of her brain, right above the pituitary. The conduction or the action potentials of the electricity will trigger the pituitary to release the hormone oxytocin. And oxytocin is such a cool hormone, also called the love or bonding hormone. So in this case, when oxytocin is released, it travels through the bloodstream to the mammary glands and causes the release of milk. Oxytocin also binds to receptors in your brain, which make you feel warm, fuzzy feelings to other people. It'll also be released if you're petting your dog. So it's not just for breastfeeding. It's known as the bonding hormone. So yeah, it's released when you're interacting with people you're fond of, and it makes you more fond of them. So it is also part of the reason that breastfeeding infants causes bonding between the mother and the infant, because it's doing double duty at this point. It's causing the release of milk, and it's also affecting the mother's brain and causing that bonding with the baby. So, and this whole system isn't quick, really. You'd think it was. You'd think the electrical signal would travel to the brain, and then the brain would send the signal back down to the mammary glands, and boom. Yeah. Oh, it doesn't. What am I talking about? The pituitary would release oxytocin, which then goes to the mammary glands. But it's this part right here. God, I'm tired of. Okay, it's this part right here. This triggers the pituitary to release the hormone ox. That's the part that takes a long time. And it's what also makes this whole process, which is perfectly natural, sometimes very frustrating to new mothers, because if it takes a long period of time, the babies can become very agitated because they want milk now and they don't get it, and they start screaming and crying, and it cuts off the signal, and you have to start again. And yeah, it can be a very frustrating cycle here, just because it's not as quick as one would think. And of course, the slow component of this is the endocrine system. It's the pituitary releasing the hormone oxytocin. It's got to get through the bloodstream. So if there's one thing you want to remember about the nervous system versus the endocrine system, is the nervous system is fast, not as long lasting. The endocrine system is slower, but tends to be longer lasting. And that's it for today.